In this recording, I want to tell you just some linguistic facts about African American English, also referred to as African American Vernacular English, and until somewhat recently referred to as Ebonics. We've already talked a bit about the nature of non standard dialects and some of the challenges faced by speakers of those dialects. It seems to be in human nature to judge people according to their particular dialect, whether it's kind of a sociolect based on their socioeconomic status or their level of education or the region that they come from, whether they are rural or urban speakers. It seems that it's part of human nature to scrutinize the way people talk and to judge them for it. And some dialects have that worse than others. But think for a second about what it means to quote unquote sound girly. Right. So if we hear someone and our knee-jerk reaction is to think, "Oh man, that person sounds girly." What does that mean? What do we hear exactly as listeners? Or likewise, if we hear someone and our judgment based on what we hear from their speech is that they sound educated or they sound rural or say redneck or hick. How about if they sound gay, quote unquote? Um, so all of these things share reactions and challenges to listeners and mainstream society. So sounding like a particular racial or ethnic identity is similar in that way. What does it mean to sound white or to sound black or to sound Hispanic? What exactly do we hear? And that's what we'll talk about specifically with respect to African American English. Now, we don't have time to cover all of the fascinating things that have been revealed in research and by many writers. Um, what I can tell you is just a few things that linguists do know about this dialect. Obviously, no professor, and certainly not me, can tell you what it's like to be a speaker of African American English. That's not possible. I am not a native speaker of this dialect. But I can tell you what linguists have studied empirically and what research has revealed. We know that African American English is English. It's mutually intelligible with Standard English. It is therefore a dialect of American English. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is a legitimate linguistic code. So, unfortunately, there's still a mainstream vein of educated people who hear African American dialect in the media, in their own students in classrooms, in songs, and judge that the speakers are less intelligent, less educated, all sorts of bad associations that are simply not true. Moreover, they judge that the code itself, like the dialect that they're hearing, is degenerate in some way, that it's less than and that it's lacking. And when linguists, who are of course the Martians, objectively studying this, when they study data from African American English, um, they don't find anything exceptional in that regard. It is a dialect. There are differences, of course. That's what makes it a different dialect. But it is a legitimate linguistic code, just like all of the non standard dialects that we've ever studied. And so, what that means is that, like all real languages and dialects, African American English has rules and grammar. Okay. So it's not some subversive, lawless, chaotic, codeless slang or something like that. It's just a dialect, and it has rules and grammar, just like everything, including standard English. Um, we know that it shares linguistic features with Southern American English. So in the South, there is a dialect that is like Southern English spoken by all races, and it it shares many features with African American English, but not all. But not all. And so even African American speakers who live in northern cities, who are speaking that dialect, they will have those features that are shared with Southern dialects. We know that African American English is understood by most African Americans who were raised in the United States. Most African Americans are capable of switching in and out of this dialect according to the social situation, meaning to whom they are speaking, what the level of formality is. Um, like other non standard dialect speakers, they can code switch and modulate their speech very often without even thinking about it. Now, there are big individual differences in how much people do this. So, some people change the way they speak more than others, and that does correlate with things like education, and the type of job that a person has, right? Um, we know that currently African American English is gaining representation in media and pop culture, and that is mostly probably a good thing, but maybe it remains to be seen if it's always truly respectful and inclusive. So let's revisit that question. What do we hear when somebody quote unquote sounds black? Um, what we hear often, when we hear a non-standard dialect, are pronunciation features, so phonetic features. And there are a couple, of course, very salient ones that are shared with Southern American English. So monophthongization, which we've talked about more than once in this course. So instead of I, saying that word like I, with a single vowel quality instead of a diphthong. There are different vowel things going on. So like the pin-pen merger, again shared with Southern American English, is also a feature that has been noted in African American English, where the words pin and pen in my Midwestern pronunciation sound like the same word, which I do very badly, but something like pin. Too bad this is going on YouTube. Hope it doesn't go viral. I'm not really a Southern speaker or an AAE speaker. So maybe I'll stop trying to recreate the IPA in this. So these are examples, again, of traits that have been documented in African American English all over the nation, North and South, East and West, that are also documented in Southern American English. A stress shift in many words is a common feature. So instead of police and hotel, shift to place primary stress on the first syllable of those words. And there are other examples as well. Another salient feature is a reduction of consonant clusters. And this commonly occurs at the ends of words or the ends of syllables. So we have some examples here. So consonant cluster simplification in restricted examples. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the grammar of this, but when we study it carefully, or if we do like a clinical linguistic study to tease out the real phonological rules at play here, it turns out it's fairly systematic, and in some cases regionally varied. So as we might expect, African American speakers in Seattle don't have the exact same dialect as African American speakers in Boston or Atlanta, right? But they share commonalities. And with this consonant cluster stuff, it turns out there's a pretty complex grammar of when and in which type of clusters we see this simplification. But suffice for you to just retain that as an example of a feature that, words like desk might see that coda consonant cluster reduced, where the final consonant is going to basically not be pronounced or be deleted. And then we have examples of words where we never get that. So that consonant cluster reduction doesn't apply to just any old word that has clusters in the coda. So here are examples where that just doesn't happen. So there are rules to this. And in the case of this example, the reduction usually applies to voiceless clusters. So studies have been done on speakers in their performance of those non-standard pronunciation traits. So here's a 1990 study by William Labov, the author of the New York department store study. And the point of the study was to show the intersection of, in this case, race and socioeconomic class. So when tallying consonant cluster reduction, so pronouncing the word test as something like tess, upper middle class speakers of color would make that reduction around 51% of the time that it was possible to do so. Middle class speakers would do that more often. So 72% of the time they would pronounce it in the non-standard dialectal way. And then the lowest class studied working class would do this the greatest majority of the time, 86% of the time, they would pronounce in the non-standard dialectal way. So there is a correlation. I'm going to come back to this, but part of what we hear, quote unquote, if somebody sounds, quote unquote, black, is that we're hearing class, like social class. As you read in your chapter, the PDF from John Rickford's book, there's African American vernacular vocabulary. This changes frequently, like in Standard English and other dialects and sociolects. But some basic aspects to the lexicon of the dialect. Linguists know that it's pan-regional, that it's often shared, again, north to south, east to west in the United States. It spans across social classes, and in some cases is uniquely exclusive to Black families in the US. In some cases, it has also become a part of mainstream lexicon. And for those words for which we know the origin, there are a surprising number. I think we would be surprised to know how many popular words we use originate from African American communities. Some interesting findings in the study of African American vocabulary or lexicon. John Rickford, in a previous study, noted important findings in group exclusivity. So he did a study about some, at the time, what we might have called slang words, but they were dialectal terms, non-standard terms used by Black New Yorkers, and other terms used commonly by white New Yorkers. And just to kind of show kind of some of the social forces at play and the divisions of neighborhoods, John Rickford did a survey in various neighborhoods and found that white New Yorkers in 1999 were using familiar terms like smashed to mean intoxicated, schlep to mean like kind of lope around, and punk as kind of, calling someone you didn't like a name, okay? And that those terms when presented to African American New Yorkers in 1999, the African American speakers were a little fuzzy. Like they didn't know exactly what smashed meant, or schlep or punk, right? Meanwhile, those speakers, African American speakers, had terms like kitchen, and kitchen does not, in African American English, it does not mean the place where in your house where you do your cooking. I mean, it can, but it also has this important other meaning, which is like a point of hair in the back of your head that's like kind of hard to cut. Um, Words like bougie and expressions like play in the dozens that white New Yorkers could not recognize. So, this is what is meant by this incredible exclusiveness, because we're talking about a densely packed city with overlapping neighborhoods, but it's like people of color are living in a different world than their neighbors right next to them, for all that they manage to not exchange the same vocabulary in some cases. Some vocabulary items have been likened to original ancient sources, including in West African languages. So, expressions that refer back to body parts, so things like bad mouth, big eye, stink eye, are commonly used in some West African languages. Um, that are spoken still by folks sharing genetic lineage with African Americans. Um, some more modern terms come from music communities, so jazz, funky, and some of these terms are going to stick around for a while. Some are going to die out, just like non-standard items. Um, you know, across the board for all speakers in all dialects. But James Baldwin famously said, "I do not know what white Americans would sound like if there had never been any black people in the United States." So a staggering number of terms came from African American communities into mainstream English and continue to do so. Now, some of these examples from Rickford are already outdated. But I'm sure you could think of more modern ones just from television shows, music, all kinds of sources. Now, one really interesting topic that is very prickly, very sensitive, is the question of whether or not we can truly hear race, say, on the telephone, right? So if a telemarketer calls you, so you can't see this person, you've never talked to this person before, you don't know this person, can you accurately tell the race of that person? And the answer is, it's complicated. And the answer is sometimes. But people, again, are walking around with pretty strong ideas, including what I've frequently encountered is that people assume that you can always tell the race of somebody on the phone, for instance. And that is definitely not true. You cannot always tell. Researchers have tried to study this in as controlled a way as possible, and that proves to be difficult, if not impossible. Here I've got a quote from the O.J. Simpson murder trial, where this very question became very important, as in life or death important. And his attorney, Johnny Cochran, said, "You can't tell by somebody's voice whether they sounded black. I resent that as a racist statement." So is that some assumption that you can always hear the race of the person on the phone? Is that racist? That too is just a very uncomfortable, prickly question that no one has a perfect answer to. Now, another highly educated person of color said about that very case, the O.J. Simpson murder trial, in fact, John Cochran got away with murder on that one. Most Americans, and especially black ones, can almost always tell that a person is black, even on the phone, even when the speaker is using standard English sentences. And that quote comes from Dr. John McWhorter, a linguist, in Losing the Race. So we have two very different points of view, how do we get to the bottom of this question? Well, again, there are studies out there. It's very hard to have some perfect, empirically sound, controlled study where it would become a psycholinguistic study to test whether, we can identify the race of the person in a recording, for instance, or, just talking on the phone without seeing the person. John Rickford conducted a study in 1972, and it was a bit simple. It basically, if I'm remembering correctly, the subjects in the study listened to recordings of people saying a single question, and that question was, "Hey, what's happening?" in 1972. Okay. So, based on hearing Black and white speakers say, "Hey, what's happening?" The listeners were able to identify the race correctly 86% of the time. But you can probably imagine shortcomings of that study if that's the only thing being said. In 1972, was that a kind of racially divided thing to say? Meaning, did one population say that more frequently than the other, and therefore be able to kind of pronounce that more naturally? There could be all kinds of problems with that. In 1986, a group of psychologists actually conducted a study trying to control for education level of the speakers recording themselves. And they were recorded in different ways, saying different types of utterances. And what they found was that when listening to highly educated speakers of all races, there was only 50% accuracy in identifying Black or white. And then Labov in 1990 conducted a sort of laboratory experiment with an aim to prove that what we hear is education and socioeconomics, not race itself. And sure enough, he was able to set up this experiment in which he had recordings from Southern white speakers and white speakers who lived in Black neighborhoods. And when people listened to those recordings, they could only correctly identify the race of the speaker 12% of the time. So there were a lot of false assumptions, and they were hearing features. They certainly weren't hearing race correctly, if that's even a thing. Similarly, Labov got recordings or produced recordings of educated Black speakers, African American speakers who lived in predominantly white neighborhoods. And again, those recordings, when heard by, sort of a general population of subjects, those subjects could only correctly identify Black or white speakers 12% of the time. So what does that tell us? We can't hear race, or there's no laboratory proof that we can hear the race of somebody, or that different races, Black or white, produce some tangible, audible speech difference that transcends things like class and education and region and all these other sociolinguistic traits. So in point of fact, things like race do intersect with class, race intersects with education level, and race intersects with geographical region, including urban versus rural distinctions. Thank you very much.